Hi, everyone. Darren Lynch, founder and CEO of Irish Titan, here with another whiskey shot. And we're graced today with Jacob Tooman from Avalara. Jacob, how you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me, Darren.
Great to have you on. Thanks for all the partnership over the last few years. It's been great to work with you.
Likewise, it's easy to work with a team like Irish Titan.
Oh, thanks. We both have strong branding, green and orange, right?
Yes, goes well
We're
together.
two-thirds of the Irish flag between our companies.
Yes, we are. That's what makes it great.
So Jacob, why don't you share just a little bit of a brief bio about yourself and Avalara with the audience, just to level set and familiarize yourself or themselves with you.
Absolutely. So my name is Jacob Tooman. I'm a strategic alliance manager for Avalara. And what Avalara does, it's a tax automation company to help businesses of all sizes become more compliant with their taxes, which is such a small sentence for how complex that can actually get, depending upon where your clients or customers are currently at in terms of their businesses and operations.
So quick little trivia, and I don't think I've ever mentioned this to you, but Avalara was one of our very first partners way back in probably 2014. We became partners with Avalara somewhere around then. Avalara is near and dear to us because of the long-standing relationship. So thanks to you and the team for all that.
That's awesome to hear. I didn't know that. So good to know.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, I just thought of it while we were talking. So I think we're going to center our conversation around B2B, which I think is a fascinating e-commerce topic and often overlooked, at least in some of the discussions, because a lot of e-commerce sort of naturally gravitates towards the sexy D2C sorts of brands and B2C, which there's a subtle distinction. That's a different conversation. But I think B2B is a massive opportunity in the e-commerce space. And I think there's a lot of blue ocean there for us to explore so that I think merchants start to familiarize themselves with the opportunity there. In our conversations, you've talked about two things that you think have had a massive impact on the B2B space. Wayfair, which you'll describe more, and this little thing called the pandemic, which I think we all know what we're referring to there. Why don't you share with everybody your thoughts around those two events that have impacted B2B?
Yeah, so those are two pretty significant events, as we all know. I think the first one was the Supreme Court's decision back in 2018, in which the state of South Dakota went up against the company that we all know, the big company, Wayfair. And what was established as a result of that ruling is that a physical location for a company does not necessarily then define your responsibilities and onus terms, like your rights in terms of having to collect and remit sales taxes. So before, what was happening is all these businesses online were selling products and services to different folks across the United States, but because it wasn't necessarily happening in real time as a physical location type of transaction, there wasn't necessarily sales tax being collected and remitted to those states, and they were missing out. And so as a result of that ruling, which had greatly affected, I think, e-commerce in general, is that you have to be super aware of what your threshold is in certain states when it comes to economic nexus. And each state now has adopted rules because of that ruling that will be affected. And they're all different, of course. They couldn't keep it simple. So it's one thing I think a lot of folks aren't aware of in terms of that decision that was made.
And I think Avalara plays a role in that, right? Like, sure, I think there's a message we all need to listen to, that we bear a responsibility for tax compliance. Yes. But that's why experts like Avalara exist, and we can lean on a company like yours to help us navigate that, right?
Absolutely, because the challenge mostly is it's just so complex, right? You have 13,000 jurisdictions in the United States alone that could have their own unique sales tax requirements. You know, you roll that up into what the state requirements then are. I mean, it would take essentially more than one person to continually be up to date on these changes, not to mention perhaps a tax holiday that a state might exercise. And recent examples would be like Colorado or Florida. Avalara has a vast content of these updates, and it has essentially an army, if you will, of people that are on top of these changes. And this alleviates sort of that burden of having to be aware of that from a business standpoint, where Avalara can help identify that and put in tools in place to automate it so that you continually remain compliant.
Right. Yeah, I think that, like, My hands are full just trying to build and grow Irish Titan. I can't imagine maintaining currency around tax compliance. So thank God there are companies like Avalara. Otherwise, the tax man cometh, and any of us might be out of compliance for sure. So the pandemic is another event that impacted just about everything, right? But share a little bit of your insights on how the pandemic impacted B2B e-commerce.
Well, with the pandemic, we all know that there was a big explosion with e-commerce, and specifically, we had a 50% growth on both the D2C side, but also the B2B side when it came to sales those first 2 years. Why that's significant is because in a B2B standpoint, you had potentially situations where now you're considering expanding your goods and services to either new markets or new products. Perhaps, as we all know, with the pandemic, there have been supply chain issues. So now you're either selling to new customers or purchasing from different suppliers because of those different shortages and other port challenges that we've heard at times during the pandemic. So all of that sort of activity and sort of newfound, I would say, stream of activity, or say purchasing and buying and decision making from a business operation were natural decisions to make, but they didn't maybe realize at that time how that affected where they stood with tax compliance if you were selling new products, expanding into new markets, or buying from new suppliers and things like that.
There's some real gold there. I think that the nugget is those of us as consumers, and we're all consumers, we all heard about supply chain problems, right? And experienced them. There's no doubt, you can't dispute that. But I think until you consider the upstream ramifications of that, you don't really understand how in the B2B space that would cause havoc, right? And with Wayfair changing how taxes are calculated and where you're classified as having a nexus, and then the pandemic changing or introducing fluidity into your supply chain and who you're working with, buying product from and selling it to, that does get pretty complex pretty quickly.
Absolutely, as well as sort of what areas and locations you're selling into. And from a B2B standpoint, you think from a global level, right? And there's a whole nother sort of tax situation outside of the United States that gets even a little bit more complicated, let alone what you're dealing with currently in the shores here.
Yeah, interesting. So I think that in your chair, Avalara's chair, you must be exposed to some of the best practices and worst practices, right? If we just use a simple analogy, best and worst in the B2B space. So what are some of the common mistakes you're seeing in the B2B e-commerce world?
Yeah, I think the first one, it's pretty simple, but I think people didn't pick up on it a lot as these transitions have happened from these two events, is failing to account properly for when you're adding new products and services and selling those products and services to your potential buyers or customers in a B2B standpoint. So as you've expanded out or changed direction, are you aware if that product is taxable in a certain way? If you're also on top of that, maybe your product involves some installation. Now you're dealing with something that may not be necessarily physical or real property, but it may or may not be taxed depending upon who and where you're using that type of service as well. So being very on top of the products, how they're taxed, where they're being sold to, and who they're being purchased from, and making sure that you're holding all that accountable in a tax compliance sphere is very important. And a lot of folks just sort of make changes, move forward, and may not realize that they're either adding tax and they shouldn't have, or they shouldn't be adding tax and now they're hit with a bill later they didn't realize they were going to have.
Yeah, neither of those are good.
Never.
What would be, I think you had in mind maybe three. I love thinking in these, right? A, B, C, red, blue, green, etc. So what would be a second mistake in the B2B space?
Yeah, part of the trilogy, if you will, right? So
there you go. Right.
A very common one, I think, and this is very much focused on B2B, is how you are managing tax exempt purchasers. So in B2Bs, if you have a tax exempt buyer, and you can become a tax exempt buyer as an example of you are purchasing this product, but then you're actually then using that product to build something else that actually will be an end product for a customer. There are scenarios like that where you should not be paying tax on that product because it's being combined into a sort of a more whole product that you're developing to then sell in the future. So what happens in that scenario is that people will come and buy from you, but they must have and put in place their tax exemption certificate, which each state has essentially their own type of tax exemption certificate. We do have 24 states that are participating now in a streamlined sales tax initiative, which sort of standardizes that certificate for those 24 states. But then you can imagine the rest, they all have their own unique sort of forms that you have to have completed and validated. And that sounds simple in theory, right? But how B2B historically is doing that is they're collecting those physical documents and or digital, and they're maybe putting them in a folder or a cabinet. But these documents have to be updated every year, or that exempt buyer now has to go through a recertification, if you will, for lack of better words, of making sure that they can still continue to be an exempt purchaser. What that now requires is going back into that cabinet or that folder and making sure those are all up to date, let alone the person who's actually doing that work is aware that if that certificate is actually a valid or a bogus certificate too, right? So it's even an expertise within that level that I think a lot of B2B businesses are maybe underestimating what it takes. Because if you have somebody making purchases and you have records in the past of being an exempt buyer, now their certificate's not up to date and they've made purchases, you're at fault for that. It's up to you to make sure that those certificates are up to date at the time of purchase. So it's a really big one for B2B.
Yeah. That's quite an ordeal to follow. That's quite a process.
Yeah, and it's something that, from a, digital landscape, it's something people may not really consider, right? But purchasers aren't going to buy from you if you're not allowing them to not pay sales tax because they know they are an exempt purchaser, right? So you need to have these processes in place if they are purchasing online to be able to do that smoothly, but also when they need to be updated to remind that user to then update their certificate and resend it back to the company so they can have the most up-to-date version at hand at all times.
Gotcha. So why don't you round out the trilogy? What's the Dark Knight Rises of the mistakes?
Yes. For B2B, it's not registering or filing properly with international authorities. This one's a big one from B2B, right? Because as you can imagine, people are purchasing from factories all over the world. And this day and age, especially in Europe, we have e-invoicing rules in place that are rather strict. And what that means in some sense is when a customer or you make a purchase from somewhere that requires to be collected sales tax, within 3 to 4 days, you must update a record in that jurisdiction, then pay that tax as part of it. And so this is something in that situation of maybe I'm switching buyers now or suppliers in a sense because of either shortages, constraints and all that. You've switched now and you've gone into a totally different maybe country or factory in that sense. If you have not followed those rules and requirements as associated with filing properly with those international authorities, you can have some serious problems down the road where at worst, you could be banned entirely from operating business in that country. So it's a pretty big one in that sense.
So Jacob, the more you shared, the more grateful I became for me, myself, not being in the tax business. That does not sound like a world that's easy to navigate and easy to maintain currency on. So, and that's just a sliver. We just scratched the surface of everything you know. So thanks.
Exactly.
Let's land the plane. What is one final takeaway that you would like to leave our audience with?
I think it's actually what you kind of just said. I think everyone should take a moment and just not underestimate what that tax compliance situation involves and what their requirements are and responsibilities are. But they should take notice and feel comfort that there are folks like us at Avalara that can help ease that burden and pain in terms of navigating that landscape when it comes to being tax compliant. Because the worst case scenario, you get audited and oh boy, we've got a serious bunch of problems. But other cases, even smaller scenarios, are just going to be headaches that take you away from focusing on growing your business and your business alone. And so that's what I think I want people to understand is do not underestimate it. Take a moment, do not dismiss. The sooner you get ahead of it or have a conversation with folks like us, the better you're going to be down the road in case something happens. God forbid it does, but that's what I want everyone to understand.
That is a great takeaway, and it's a great piece of advice. Thanks for sharing all those insights with everybody. We appreciate it, Jacob. And thanks to you and Avalara for all the partnership over the years and advance going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Darren, and thank you, Irish Titans. It's been great to be here.
All right. With that, we're going to wrap up. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you soon. Sláinte.